Good afternoon, distinguished guests, commanders, command sergeant majors, soldiers, civilians, and family members. On behalf of the 7th Army Joint Multinational Training Command, the United States Army Garrison Bavaria, and the 18th Military Police Brigade, I would like to thank you for coming to the 2015 USAG Bavaria Women's Equality Day celebration. I am First Lieutenant Hannah Martins, and I will be your Mistress of Ceremony for today's observance. At this time, please stand for the playing of the German and American national anthems, and remain standing for the invocation by Chaplain Joseph Colanzo of the 18th MP Brigade.
Let us pray. Our God, we thank you because before you, we are all special. We've gathered here today, Lord, to sensitize ourselves on how we can relate to one another. Please help us, oh God, men and women, to treat one another with dignity, respect, and honor. And now may you bless our presence here today. In your name we pray. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. At this time, 709th MP Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Bragg has some opening remarks. He is here today representing the command group of the 18th MP Brigade.
So on behalf of Colonel Horton and Command Sergeant Major Breckenridge, who are currently at the senior leader course here with all the other brigade commanders and youths, we're welcome. You know, it's great to see we had such a great turnout. It's 2 years in a row that we've been a part of this event. I think it's fitting that either the 709th or the 18th MP Brigade hosts this, mainly because the MP Corps has been integrated for a long, long time. Women serving in the military, women serving in combat has not been anything new for the MP Corps. We've had women serving in military police duty since the 1940s. Documented women have been injured in combat in both Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm, and most recently, obviously, in OIF and OEF. So as the debate rages on throughout the rest of the Army and the rest of the world with should women be serving in the front lines, it's been a moot issue for the MP Corps because we've been doing it for so long, and we do it very well. We've learned the trials and tribulations of integrating the force, and we've learned that it's not difficult, it's not hard. We don't have to have separate living conditions when we go to the field. We don't have to treat the women any differently than we do the men when it comes to training and preparing for combat and or execution in combat. So again, welcome for everybody being here. We got a great program. Hopefully you get something out of it as we reflect back on where we've been and where we're moving forward. Thank you.
In 1971, the U.S. Congress designated August 26th as Women's Equality Day at the request of Representative Bella Abzug from New York. The date was selected to commemorate the 1920 passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which granted women the right to vote. This was the culmination of a massive and peaceful civil rights movement by women that had its formal beginnings in 1848 at the world's first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. The observance of Women's Equality Day not only commemorates the passage of the 19th Amendment, but also calls attention to women's continuing efforts towards full equality. Workplaces, libraries, organizations, and public facilities now participate with Women's Equality Day programs, displays, video showings, and other activities. Poetry has always been a way to express individual feelings of joy, sorrow, outrage, humor, and hope. Powerful poetry can even evoke the consciousness of an entire cause. In an interview with the Academy of Achievement, Maya Angelou shared that she wrote Phenomenal Woman for women everywhere, saying, "I wrote it for Black women, and white women, and Chinese women, and Japanese women, and Jewish women. I wrote it for Native American women, Aleut, Eskimo ladies. I wrote it for all women, very fat women, very thin, pretty, plain." Please welcome Chief Warrant Officer 2 Bennett as she recites the poem Phenomenal Woman, written by Maya Angelou and published in 1978.
Pretty women often wonder where my secret lies, because I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model size. So when I tell them, they think I'm telling lies. I say it's the reach in my arms, the span in my hip, the joy in my feet, and the curl in my lip. I am a woman, phenomenal woman, that's me. I often walk in a room just as cool as can be, and for a man, they stand or fall down on their knees, and then hive around me like a hive of honeybees. I say it's the fire in my eyes, the flash in my teeth, the swing in my waist, and the joy of my feet. I am a woman, phenomenal woman, that's me. Men themselves often wonder what they see in me. They try so hard, but they can't reach my inner missionary. And when I try and show them, they say they still can't see. I say it's the arch in my back. It's the sun in my smile. It's the ride of my breast and the grace of my style. I am a woman, phenomenal woman, that's me. Now you can understand just why my head's not bowed. I don't have to jump or shout or talk real loud, but when you see me walking by, you ought to be proud. I say it's the click in my heels, it's the bend in my hair, it's the palm of my hands and the weight of my care. I am a woman, phenomenal woman, that's me.
Thank you, Chief Bennett, for that heartfelt rendition. Please welcome First Lieutenant Maria Steen, singing Every Moment by Joy Williams, a song that urges a determination much like that displayed by the suffragettes over so many decades.
midnight, melting to morning, a moment faded to memory. All these days, oh, they slip away through our fingers, so don't let go. Hold on to every moment. Always know. Hold on to every moment that you can. Move on with no regrets to our destiny. Held by the hands of our Father, we share His love, and He leads us through all these days. Oh, they slip away through our fingers, so don't let go. Hold on to every moment. Always know. Hold on to every moment that you Oh, running from yesterday into tomorrow. Don't let it just drift away. Forget about tying the hands of time. Live every moment for the one who gave us today. La 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 la. Don't let go. Hold on to every moment. Always know. Hold on to every moment that you can. La 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 la.
Thank you, Lieutenant Steen. Thank you, Lieutenant Steen, for that beautiful song. Every equality movement in history has had support from those outside of the group that stands to benefit directly. It's on. One male voice of support was William Topaz McGonigal, who wrote the poem Women's Suffrage, recited today by specialist Matthew Wiley.
Fellow men, why should the Lords try to despise and prohibit women from having the benefit of a parliamentary franchise when they pay the same taxes as you and me? I consider they ought to have the same liberty. And I consider if they are not allowed the same liberty, from taxation, every one of them should be set free. And if they are not, it is really very unfair. In an act of injustice, I solemnly declare. Women, farmers, have no protection as the law now stands. And many of them have lost their property and their lands, and have been turned out of their beautiful farms, and by the unjust laws of the lands and the sheriff's alarms. And in my opinion, such treatment is very cruel. And my fair play, 'tis said, is a precious jewel. But such treatment causes women to fret and to dote, because they are deprived of the parliamentary franchise vote. In my opinion, what a man pays, he certainly should get, and if he does not, he will certainly fret. And why wouldn't women do the very same? Therefore, to defend the parliamentary franchise, they are not to blame. Therefore, let them gather and demand a parliamentary franchise. I'm sure no reasonable man will their actions despise. For trying to obtain privileges most unjustly withheld from them, which Mr. Gladstone will certainly encourage and never condemn. And as for the working women, many are driven to the point of starvation, all through the tendency of the legislation. Besides, upon members of Parliament they have no claim as a deputation, which is a very great shame. Yes, the Home Secretary of the present day, against working women's deputations, has always said nay. Because they haven't got the parliamentary franchise, that is the reason why he does them despise. And that, in my opinion, is really very unjust. But the time is not far distant, I most certainly trust, when women will have the parliamentary vote, and many of them, I hope, will wear a better petticoat. And I hope that God will aid them in this enterprise and enable them to obtain a parliamentary franchise and rally together and make a bold stand and demand a parliamentary franchise throughout Scotland. And do not rest day nor night, because your demands are only right. And in the eyes of reasonable men, in God's eyesight, in heaven, I'm sure, will defend the right. Therefore, go on, brave women, and never fear, although your case may seem dark and drear, and put trust in God, for he is strong, and you will have gained parliamentary franchise before very long.
Thank you, Specialist Wiley, for giving us a glimpse into the thoughts of a man in the late 1800s supporting the women's suffrage movement. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me as we explore some of the milestones in this prolonged struggle for voting rights. During the American Revolution, the American colonies fought against Great Britain for the formation of an independent United States. Women within colonial America were primarily concerned with domestic and family affairs and depended on their fathers and husbands to represent them publicly. John Adams, lawyer, diplomat, and second President of the United States, was an influential figure during the American Revolution. He participated in the debate over the nature of the new government and traveled to Europe to help negotiate the peace treaty with Great Britain. During his travels, he debated the political place of women through correspondences with politicians such as statesman James Sullivan, but also with his wife, Abigail. The following letters provide a window into the views of Abigail and John Adams on the political place of women during the Revolutionary era.
My dearest John, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of a friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity and impunity? Men of sense in all ages arbor those customs which treat us only as vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. Adieu.
My dearest Abigail, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy. I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the names of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. I'm sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or ochlocracy. A fine story indeed. I begin to think the ministry as deep as they are wicked. After stirring up Tories, land jobbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, Russians, Irish Roman Catholics, Scotch renegados, at last they have stimulated thee to demand new privileges and threaten to rebel. Yours, John.
My dearest John, I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things in which are very hard, very liable to be broken, and, would notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. Adieu.
It's 50 years later, and the courtroom is packed for the trial of Susan B. Anthony, the foremost leader of the women's rights movement in the United States. What crime was she accused of committing? In November 1872, she and 15 other women in Rochester, New York, had demanded to be registered and had voted in the national election. Soon after, all 16 women were arrested. Of the 16 women, only the leader, Susan B. Anthony, was put on trial. Hers would be a test case. If she could convince the jury that she had a right under the U.S. Constitution to vote, she would be found not guilty. Then all U.S. women would win the right to vote.
The 14th Amendment did forbid any state from denying the right to vote to any male inhabitants. However, it also stated, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. Are not women citizens of these United States? And if citizens cannot be denied the right to vote, it seems plain enough that women cannot be denied the right to vote.
Ms. Anthony, you are being charged with voting on November 5th, 1872, and at the time you were a woman. Do you deny this fact?
Your Honor, in judgment of the jury, your defense wishes to concede the fact that Ms. Susan B. Anthony is indeed a woman. Further, if the same act had been done by her brother, it would have been honorable. But having been done by a woman, it is said to be a crime. I believe this is the first instance in which a woman has been arraigned in a criminal court merely on account of her sex.
The 14th Amendment gives no right to a woman to vote. The vote of Miss Anthony was in violation of the law. I direct the jury to find a verdict of guilty.
I strongly object, Your Honor. This is a criminal court, and the jury must decide the guilt or innocence of the defendant.
I direct the court reporter to enter a vote of guilty.
The next day, Judge Hunt was about to sentence Anthony, but he made one mistake. He asked her the usual question.
Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence should not be pronounced?
Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say. In your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored.
The court orders the prisoner to sit down. I will not allow another word. The sentence of the court is that you pay a $100 fine and the cost of prosecution.
May it please, Your Honor, I shall never pay a dollar of your unjust penalty, and I shall earnestly and persistently continue to urge all women that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
Although Anthony lost, the trial was a turning point in the struggle for women's suffrage. Until then, people had ridiculed Anthony as an old maid who wanted to upset the traditional authority of men. But the courage she had shown at her trial won her new respect. Gradually, public opinion swung in her favor. It would take years of struggle, but women one day would win the right to vote. Though it would be 18 years after Anthony's trial that female suffrage would be nationally recognized, her righteousness was fueled and sustained because territorial legislatures were already beginning to recognize it. Wyoming was the forward-thinking trailblazer that first granted women the right to vote. The story began in the 1860s when an uneducated Virginian, William Bright, and his wife Julia moved to Salt Lake City in pursuit of a better life. Soon after, gold was discovered near where the Oregon Trail crossed South Pass, and a gold rush began.
Julia, I'm told there is gold rush in Wyoming, and opportunities for riches are abound. We should take advantage of this opportunity before more miners move to the area. There is a town called South Pass, not far from the Oregon Trail. I'll move there this summer and establish our claims.
William, it will truly be difficult for young William Jr. and I to go with you, since there is no prospect of a home for us to live. You should go ahead and establish your mining stakes and build a home for our family. William Jr. and I will follow as soon as you call for us.
In 1867, William Bright did move to South Pass City. A year passes and William has earned mining claims, owns a saloon, and is considering a second calling as a politician.
Julia, this separation has been hard on our family. I have thought many times over the last year that I should go into politics.
William, I support you in whatever endeavor you undertake. I hope and pray that you are able to establish greater rights for women. Denying women the right to vote is a gross injustice.
Julia, I will bring forth legislation that will allow women the right to vote. I received a bill from Miss Esther Morris that she asked me to present to our legislature. I believe passing this legislation will also encourage women across the United States to move to Wyoming. This will be a step in the right direction for our territory.
William Bright succeeded.
I, Governor John A. Campbell, do hereby sign into law the following. An act to grant the women of Wyoming Territory the right of suffrage and to hold office. Being enacted by the House of Representatives of the Territory of Wyoming, that every woman of the age of 21 years residing in this territory may, at every election to be holden under the laws thereof, cast her vote. And her rights to elective franchise and to hold office shall be the same under the election laws of the territory as those of electors. This act shall take effect and be enforced from and after its passage. Approved, December 10th, 1869.
Wyoming's decision was momentous, but easy to dismiss as an outlier while it remained a remote territory. When it attained statehood in 1890, Wyoming presented a staunch defense of the right to female suffrage and succeeded in preventing it from revocation. Thus, Wyoming entered the Union with a nickname, the Equality State, and soon inspired similar legislation in Colorado, Utah, and Idaho in the 1890s. Ultimately, however, individual states' laws would not be enough. Only 10 additional states had joined Wyoming by 1914. It would take a constitutional amendment and a vigorous campaign for state ratification of this amendment before meaningful and lasting change was made.
Extra, extra, read all about it. Women are given right to vote. Extra, extra, read all about it.
The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article of appropriate legislation.
Finally, on August 26, 1920, the states ratified the 19th Amendment. The ratification fulfilled the prophetic last speech of Susan B. Anthony, given at a convention in Baltimore. Her final words to the audience earned her a 10-minute ovation. "I am here for a little time only, and then my place will be filled," she said. The fight must not cease. You must see that it does not stop. Failure is impossible. At this time, Lieutenant Colonel Bragg will introduce our guest speaker.
Real quick, let's give a round of applause. I'm just going to detour for a second. So I heard a voice in the back that I thought was familiar. So I'm pretty sure that was probably C-Dub from AFN the Eagle, DJ. Okay, so if you listen, if you're a fan in the morning, you probably heard the Flying Hawaiian say that she was late this morning coming into work. So now we know she was probably rehearsing. So that's good. They do a really good job in the morning. So if you guys don't know, it's a really good radio station to check out on your way to PT. So I have the pleasure of introducing Miss Audrey Bender. Now, if you went through and you read through the actual program, you'll see that she was an MP. That wasn't the only reason we invited her. It had a little bit to do with why we invited her, but she is a pillar of the community. You know, as the director of family and MWR here in Graff, the decisions she makes every day impact you and your families in a tremendous way. But she's also a huge pillar in just the U.S. Army garrison Bavaria, and she has been for quite some time. So please help me in welcoming her to the stage.
Wow, thank you so much for inviting me to address you today on women's equality. I have to admit, it makes me feel just a little bit old as I become, and here publicly become, an artifact to this history. So what I'd like to start with is to actually take us from where the dramatization left off and bring us a little further forward, and then share with you where my personal history intersects with the history of the women's movement. Okay, so 1920s, 30s and 40s. I'm going to speed through this era. The 20s were dominated by Prohibition. We saw Depression. We saw the Dust Bowl, and we've seen images of intense poverty in the United States. And yet the women's movement continued. The force at that time was really about equality in the workplace and working towards making sure that women weren't abused in the workplace, while the nation as a whole and the world as a whole was still struggling with some very, very critical societal issues. The 30s introduced us to a Second World War, and the world's focus became that. But again, the women's movement continued even through that, and we saw a lot of advancements made. And you have to excuse me, but we're a military audience, so I'm going to keep it pretty military as I talk about it. But for the Second World War, we saw a great interest in recruiting women, not just into military-like positions, but women also entered the workforce in huge numbers to replace the men who had been called off to war. And that was a turning point in our history, because up until that time, it was more or less unusual for women to be in the workplace, and now they were a critical contributor to not only America's economy, but to the success of the Second World War. With that introduction of women into the workforce, things came to be like childcare, which wasn't something that we even given a thought to. But you can't put women to work without childcare. And so society had to consider the implications of that. And then we had the images of Rosie the Riveter and some of these other folks. We started to see women emerge as not frail creatures, but powerful, strong, determined people who could not only pick up the mission and carry the mission, but could sustain that mission indefinitely if necessary. And as we know, wars are never really, really short. And so it took a lot of years. We already heard mentioned that as a result of perhaps the World War, we saw women recruited directly into supporting military police roles. And so it is with great gratitude, I suppose, that whoever made that decision, they need to be congratulated because they recognize the need. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier is not only did they have the authority over women at that time, but they also had the authority over men. While separate yet apart, they still were endowed with the authority that would be important because, again, it placed them in a position of respect. It placed or cast women in a new role, even to military men at that time, that they could exercise authority over them as well. And again, another pivotal moment in our history. We would also see the Women's Army Corps come into existence. Because up until that time, women were serving in an auxiliary role. They weren't actually active duty personnel. That changed with the Women's Army Corps, and they are actually granted full rights in both the active and the reserve forces of all forces, including the newly established Air Force. 1940s we're talking about. So again, a pivotal time, and perhaps the catalyst was war. Oftentimes it is for change in all societies, but we saw women emerging. The 1950s, we're moving, fortunately my history starts just a little bit later. The 1950s, war again would define our nation. This time we're in Korea. There was a deliberate action at that time to recruit women to go to Korea. They needed women in Korea. They didn't have sufficient number of males in the combat support roles and service support roles, so they needed women, and they deliberately went after females to support that particular war. And a term or an acronym you're probably familiar with, DACOITS, which is still around today in a lot of the readings, but the Defense Advisory Commission on Women in Service in Korea War, they brought this particular body into existence with that purpose. That particular body's mission would change over time, and they would become one of the driving forces behind equality of women in the uniformed services. Now, just for those of you who probably haven't been with us since the 1950s, some other things were happening. Alaska and Hawaii, by the way, were just becoming United States. They were the last two to join us, the 49th and 50th state. So there was a lot happening in the world at that time. It was also the golden age of television. And I mention television because we talk about changing societal attitudes. And up until television, radio dominated. Movies dominated what people heard and saw and talked. Prior to that was newspapers. And with each new advancement, we see societal change result. And so the golden age of television introduced the ability into households for people to receive information that may not have been exactly the point of view of an immediate family member, their community, the places that they lived and grew up. They were exposed to a more global view of things. And it also provided an opportunity because the people in that industry are not foolish. When you see that something is popular and you watch the trends, you start producing movies, television programs that appeal to the greater audience, and we started to see the introduction of more change. So now we get to the 60s, and now this starts to intersect with my personal history. But in the 60s, we had the Equal Pay Act. There was a lot of concern, a lot of reports that despite all of the earlier efforts that women still were being discriminated against in the workplace, that they weren't being paid fairly, they were working long hours without compensation. Some other things were going on, though. Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique. And that all sounds very mysterious, but what it was a book that talked about the dissatisfaction that women at that time had with the very narrow role that they were given in society. And it was immensely popular. It took off like a wildfire. Well, at the same time, we're starting to see television start to challenge some of the societal attitudes. And once again, here's TV, who recognizes millions of women primarily, but also men, were reading this book, and they were not happy with the narrow role that society had assigned to women. And so what do you suppose that launched on television? We started to see the emergence of stronger female characters. We saw them emerge also in the literature. And so now we were being exposed to Perry Mason and Della Street. We saw the emergence of women not just taking orders or not playing a more subservient role, but were actually part of the decision making. They were taking on functions. They were starting to demonstrate, if you will, the skills that we would recognize in men as making them valuable to politics, to industry, to the sciences, to the math world, wherever we happen to go. There were some other things that were going to happen in the 60s that were going to shape the world. Of course, the assassinations of our president at the time, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King's assassination, affirmative action, we had civil rights. Well, along comes, in 1962, me. For those of you trying to struggle with the math, I'll admit it, I'm 53 years old, okay? Proud of it. I'm glad I'm still able to stand up. But I benefit from this history now, because this becomes part of my personal history. When my parents were thinking about me, they weren't thinking about any of that stuff. They weren't thinking about the person that I would become. They were just worried about raising an infant, and they were pretty young themselves. So now we move into the 70s. Of course, the 70s also, we saw, which is going to be particularly important to me, we saw the ban on gender discrimination in schools. What did that mean? And why is that important now to my personal history and to all of your history? Well, up until that time, it was okay to treat boys and girls different in terms of the emphasis placed on their education, the types of courses that they were given the opportunity to take, and probably more important, and you're going to be shocked perhaps with my statement, but it also leveled the playing field, so to speak, to use a sports pun, and made it imperative that boys and girls have the same access to sports. Why does that become important? Well, to build stamina, to build strength, to be able to demonstrate that you are capable to handle and take on some of these other functions, these other duties, these other responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, up until that point, we were the weaker sex. And as the weaker sex, we didn't really have many opportunities to demonstrate that we could run 2 miles. I'm going to use military stuff, that we could do all those push-ups and those sit-ups. But as sports got introduced into schools and girls had the opportunity to participate in those, they began to become more athletically inclined. They built upper and lower body strength, they had endurance, and they could take on other missions. And they could demonstrate their ability. So it was pretty significant. It's embedded in the history, and you often don't even hear about it. But it was, again, another turning point, because without it, how many female athletes can you possibly remember before that time? The opportunities just weren't there. Okay, by this time I'm in 3rd grade, just if you're keeping the math going. Okay? In the 70s, we also saw some tragedies, world events. We're in Germany. You know, we can't go on without mentioning that we had one of the first publicized, if you will, terrorist attacks, and that was at the Olympic Games in 1972. It began to define some of our future history. We saw a lot of strong female characters emerging on television. It was really kind of tragic the other day when I was trying to figure out how I was going to put this out there. I asked for some examples of strong female characters, and I couldn't get any real responses. In my time, it was all about policewoman. It was all about Lieutenant Aurora and Star Trek. It was all about the bionic woman. It was about Superwoman, Wonder Woman. There was lots of women. Suddenly they're all strong, and they sometimes had superhuman strength. But that's what I was seeing on TV. This was starting to frame my attitudes about what defined me as a woman. I'm from Connecticut, now Florida, and again, maybe it's just circumstantial, just happenstance. But the Coast Guard was one of the first services to open all its branches to women. Just so happens we have a Coast Guard Academy in Connecticut, not very far from where I live. And so it wasn't uncommon to see women in uniform where I lived. Didn't think it's no thought about it. 1973, the Vietnam era, we had mentioned in the 60s. Of course, it kicks off in the 50s, it takes us through the 60s, and doesn't actually end until 1975. But with it, what also ended was the draft, and we moved to an all-volunteer force. With that came the need to fill the ranks, quotas. How many people, I can't really see you, so it doesn't matter if you raise your hands, but those of you who've been on recruiting duty, quotas, we have goals, we don't call them quotas, right? We have goals that we try to achieve in terms of bringing new people into the military. Well, there was a specific goal set at that time to recruit people, and curiously enough, women were extremely interested in becoming more a part of the military communities. And so we saw more and more women recruited, and we actually saw very specific goals set for recruiting women into the military. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I'm going to slow it down into the 70s because it becomes kind of important to my personal history. So we're in the 70s now. It's the late 70s. The Women's Army Corps is eliminated. Women are integrated into the regular force. And at the time, I had no idea that I was a participant in the Army's first societal experiment in integrating women into the military via basic combat training. And those of you who know me, a couple of you I recognize in the audience, have often heard me say, I don't know what happened to the Army I was in. The Army that I was recruited into was different than the Army I saw in the 90s. What happened? Because the Army that I was recruited into had me go through basic training in AIT, 1 platoon females, 3 platoon males, and we did everything everybody else did. We marched, we drilled, we slept, not together, but in the same quads. Okay, everything we did. There was no exception. There wasn't this group go do this to this standard, and this group you go do this to this standard, and at the end of the day we'll come together and pretend we did it all together. That's not what we did. We did it all. I threw hand grenades. I fired every caliber of weapon the Army had to offer at that point in time. Road marched, hand-to-hand combat. For those of you who've been around a while, we did the whole, choke until you pass out experience. They've since changed that. That's a good thing. It's not really safe. But we were told, you're a soldier.
Yes.
Now, we got the Iran thing going on at that time, and for those of you who don't remember that history, we had a bunch of hostages taken in Iran. And so, as a part of this whole, we're not going to differentiate. We still hadn't said women could be in combat roles, okay? Military police wasn't identified as a combat MOS. But every morning, much to, I'm sure, the drill sergeant's delight, blaring over the intercom, it was always, get up, get your gear, we're going to Iran. We didn't take it as a joke. It was treated serious.